Evening, all. This is Rope Aficionado, also known as Dustin, tonight with Neuromancer on the Dominance Dialogues. And tonight we have an episode titled Surrender Your Brain, the Neuroscience of Rope. Welcome, Neuromancer. Thank you for joining us.
Hello.
Uh-oh, I'm not getting audio.
Ah, can you hear me now? Testing, testing.
Not hear you. I just heard you. I know I did.
Did just hear. Let's see.
Oh, there
Turn
it
it up a
is
bit.
on my end.
Okay. Good. Hello.
All right. How are you? Welcome.
Thank you. I'm doing great. And you?
I'm very excited for this discussion. I think a lot of people are. I think just on FetLife we had over 500 RSVPs. It may be our biggest episode. Um, Neuromancer, I'd love for you to give us a little introduction about yourself and your experience inside of the community, and maybe even a touch on your professional experience if you care to.
Sure. So by day, I am a neuroscientist. I work in psychiatric neuroscience, and my involvement in the kink community has been for about 11 and a half, maybe 12 years now. I actually got in through research and liked what I found there and stayed. The teaching that I do is really to give back to the community because really the community helped launch a lot of my professional research in the extremes of emotion where scientific studies don't usually go.
I One of my most memorable classes that I've attended was a class I think I attended at this point maybe 6 or 8 years ago, where you talked I don't remember what the title was, but it was the neuroscience behind a TK specifically. And it was a discussion that I'll never forget. It was just an approach that I haven't heard before. And as someone that is scientific minded, it was very exciting. And, fast forward 6, 8 years later to be able to have you on and interview you and pick your brain a little bit, no pun intended. It's humbling. So I do appreciate you offering us your time and experience. So we will go ahead and get started with our questions. The first question I have for you tonight is, what inspired you to study the neuroscience behind rope, and how did you conduct your research?
So, in the very early days, I was researching depression, and depressed people have a hard time being happy about things, they- especially sexual things were hard for a lot of depressed people to engage with. And we wanted to understand this phenomenon a little bit better, which meant doing work on sexual arousal in a lab. And and the question we had was, is it that depressed people have sort of a lesion where their brain just doesn't get aroused at all? Or do you need to push them to a higher threshold? And so we started using vibrators in the lab and pushing people all the way up to the brink of or past orgasm. And it turned out when you do brain measurements, people have to hold their head very still. And people were not holding their head very still during orgasm. So I started asking around and who could help me hold people's heads very still during orgasm? Does anybody have the technology for that? Does anybody know how to do that? And someone said, you should really get out to a munch. There will be a lot of people there who could help. So I got out to a munch, and it turned out that first night that everybody was very willing to help me with that difficulty in my research, and I had to learn how to rig. So they taught me how to hold people's heads very still, and we ended up the people who wanted to come in And the subjects in that research were a lot kinksters. And we started measuring people's brains and how they reacted to being held still during sexual arousal. And it was stuff I'd never seen before. And that got me really interested. So the rest is really history because we found that a lot of the reaction wasn't even so much the sexual arousing stimuli that we thought we were using, it was the rope itself.
Interesting. So, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're saying that the rope itself had more of an impact than the actual sexual stimulation?
Well, the sexual stimulation was a very simple story. Vibrator turns on, what do people do with it? The rope felt like it was a lot more nuanced. And what we realized was that whereas depressed people were very good at spinning good things bad, the kinky people we were measuring were very good at spinning painful, punishing, and difficult things as good and interesting and something to be aroused about. And I felt like if we learned about that, we could learn about how to help people spin different narratives. What that pushed us to understanding was how much of rope really is about the narrative and what you bring to it. If you feel like this is constraining and difficult and not something I want to be involved with, your brain activity is going to reflect either high arousal and a lot of negative emotion, or you may shut down entirely and you might get no arousal out of it at all. In contrast, if you lean in and find reward in it, we can find all sorts of brain signatures of reward and brain signatures of trancy, floaty, and arousal all moving together.
That is, and interesting to say that that was part of your research and your day job. Um, wow, I don't know if it could get much more interesting for a research experiment. I think that there's a lot of support inside of the chat right now for this kind of research. So that's kind of leads us into the next question. Um, what are some of the key findings that have advanced your understanding of the brain and the behavior in rope bondage scenarios?
Right. So I will give you three key findings, which will probably end up coming back as themes tonight. Arch. The first one I mentioned already, which is that rope is your narrative. It's what you make of it. And the same rope could be very different for two different people. One observation we have had is that if you think of emotion on a globe where positive and negative down by the equator are very different, and this is arousal, general arousal, how calm you are, going up like longitude lines, positive and negative often meet up at the top and are almost indistinguishable. So in the brain, intense reward and intense punishment are distinguishable. Positive and negative, when they're intense, we can't tell them apart. So it's a matter of then what you do with it. It's why we laugh at funerals and have cute aggression. These things become very plastic, and where you go ends up being what your rope experience. Second theme, rope is a lot about communication between the people involved. Um, and in particular, then, rope is a lot about listening. I think for everybody involved. The person being tied is listening to the top's intent. The person who's tying is listening to the reaction and the desires of the person being tied. And that listening is what allows us to not only have consent to what's going on, but to trust each other and to facilitate leading in. Um, so, what we often find is that there's a dialogue in rope. And I can show you a little bit of this here. I'm going to share a screen for instance.
1 second. It
And
does seem like we do have a little bit of an audio issue. let me see if I can fix anything on my end, but if you wanna go ahead and screen share now, you're welcome to.
Okay. So this was simultaneously recording little Leo being tied by Victory at Sea. And this is recording their EEG. What you're seeing up here is activity in the gamma band. It's associated with arousal and dopamine function. And at first, Victory at Sea, who was tying, had a whole lot of likely cognitive activity and arousal while planning the tie and starting to put the rope on. And then when the rope was on, little Leo responded with their own level of arousal. So that's a communication where they listened to what was going on and leaned in. And here, Victory is now tying, and their arousal went down. Another pair, this is Dyphon and Clinky tying together. You can see down here, this is lower frequency activity. This is very transy um, activity associated called alpha and theta activity. You can see they're very in sync. They were leaning in together, they were listening to each other and feeling together. And when we plot out the traces of their brains, they're almost identical in a lot of ways, as they're having very similar experiences of leaning in and leaning out together. So the third message and last message I'll give you for main findings is that growth is often about control. Voluntarily giving up some control, voluntarily having control. You see that very fast activity in the brain associated with control in the prefrontal cortex being mobilized by people who are being tied when they're helping out the person tying them, like right before suspension when you position yourself just to so. You see it when people are tying when they're thinking about safety, when they're thinking about the structure of the tie. People lean in together and breathe with each other and rock together. That's a lot of giving up control. And then you see more brain signatures for arousal.
So, it sounds like there's, to some level, a direct connection between control and arousal.
In many ways, yes. So the newest so if you think the lizard parts of our brains, the older parts of our brains, are associated with fear, reactivity, and basic drives like sexual arousal. The newer parts of our brains are associated more with thinking and planning, and they have a mutually inhibitory relationship. So if we're afraid, we might run away without thinking very hard. Or if we say, no, 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 I've got to look good for this podcast, I shouldn't run out of the room just because I'm scared of the 500 people who are watching. That's me asserting control over those basic arousal systems.
Interesting. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. I think that, I mean, at least for me personally, there is, I talk about how rope for me has sexual energy that doesn't necessarily equate to traditional sex, but it does carry sexual energy for me. And I try to be very clear and communicate that with anybody that I engage with rope.
Yeah. So the way I would understand that in many ways is that arousal is arousal. What you do with it, how you interpret it, is yours to your story to tell. So if, for example, you become very scared and you decided that that's hot, it might be sexualized for you. And it's different than traditional sexual arousal in that it doesn't happen to involve anything genital, but it is in the brain just like any other sexual arousal. Um, yeah,
I think that segues us into our very next question. So you kind of started to answer some of that, but what are the main effects of rope bondage on the brain and the body, and how do they differ between tops and bottoms or even switches?
sure. So I would say the main effects are going to differ. If you've met one rope person, you've met one rope person, um, and it's where they go with that experience. There's a lot we do with rope that facilitates an experience. Um, and that is providing context. And in that context, maybe a lot of function of the negotiation. And then you allow it to go there. So, for example, if you negotiate that I'm providing a safe context in which the person being tied can lean in and play around with their own level of intense experience, then sure, I can put rope on them, which allows them to struggle and might provoke some level of reactivity, and that's exactly what we'll find. Um, so again, I think the biggest main effect there is allowing some play between loss of control or assertion of control and arousal, um, while preserving safety. Allowing some loss of control looks very different than trying to preserve academic objectivity while you're being tied. And so then there's a tightrope between the person tying and the person receiving the rope, um, both keeping the context safe, keeping their trust high, and allowing that leaning in. One thing I should mention is that trust as a concept, and we'll talk a little bit about this later probably, is associated with being able to lean in and that brain synchronization. You asked about differences between people who are tying and being tied and people who switch. I would say they use control differently. For the person being tied, their planning and control often happens on a lot. And in the moment when they have to make decisions like, should I say something about this? Should I help the person tying? Um, the person who is tying, on the other hand, is asserting control while they are tying, and then has to think about, when do I stop moving? When do I allow myself to lean in and actually have a simultaneous sympathetic experience with the person I'm tying, versus when am I worried about, are my knots exactly right? Am I making things exactly aesthetic in the way I want to?
Hmm.
Um,
So,
often for people who are rope switches. Oh, sorry, go on.
so I'm not a neuroscientist, but is this like where the difference between like the low road and the high road in our brain, or as a top, where we're having to figure out where to balance between?
Yeah, yeah. This is exactly the tightrope between what some people will call low road and high road. Um, and so you will find often with people who are tied with a trusted partner that they've tied with for a long time, and they have an established dynamic, it's very easy for them to give up that control and lean in and allow themselves to quickly have an intense experience. With a new partner, on the other hand, sometimes people are second guessing and they're saying, is this safe? And that's a lot of thinking and a lot of preserved control, which again, you can go wherever you want with it.
So that actually there's a question I need to find. We actually have a couple questions, so we'll address them real quick. Um, what- So one we have is, do you think rope helps gives our brain access to our executive control? And how do you think control is a way to help get us out of our survival or emotional stages?
I love that question. I love that question, especially because usually the question I get is rope a way for us to give up control? Um, Asking, does rope allow us to have control, is interesting in a few ways. For the person tying, um, we very often see somebody who is, for example, ruminating and worrying and anxious right up until somebody's life is in their hands. And they're like, no, I got to focus about that. And all the brain's evolutionary protective mechanisms come on, and you get extra resources for being able to assert control, and all sorts of frontal activity more associated with paying attention, cognitive planning, and adjustment come on. So yeah, I think for the person tying, rope often serves a focusing function. If somebody is more prone to ADHD, for example, you get a lot of hyper focus that comes in when somebody starts to tie. For somebody being tied, if the intention of the tie is empowerment and control, I've seen people use that very effectively. So I'm an acrobat. I love it when somebody ties me in a way that I can do things I couldn't do for myself. And one of my rope partners that I just love tying with Vixie also is like this, where we will plan ties so that she can actually um, move in ways that she couldn't move outside rope. And it's usually some inverted position that she's never been in before. And all of a sudden, you're bringing on levels of control and types of control, because if you don't have them, it could be very dangerous. And it's a trusted context, so she doesn't have to worry necessarily about preserving safety as much as examining what does this tie let me do. So you're outsourcing some of the evolutionary protective mechanisms so that you can lean in more to the executive control. I will mention one more thing, which is we see something in rope that I've often seen in long-term meditators and extreme athletes, which is a simultaneous presence of a high level of brain activity, executive control in the prefrontal areas, along with a lot of sort of trancy, leaned in feeling. And you'd say, oh, but you should only be able to have one of these. Again, with high levels of meditation, with very experienced people who are in rope, you get these simultaneously. And I've asked professional acrobats about this, and they've said, yeah, I need that. Because if I am in pain, for example, and I don't lean into that and allow the pain and yet think about what I'm doing, I will either um, spend my whole time masking and not be a good acrobat, or I will just frankly be dangerous because I've lost too much control.
As a rope top, it's a delicate balance between like the control between what I exert on my bottom, maintaining the control of um my ability to maintain responsibility, right? And not to get lost in that top space. And this is where I've talked about it before, where I personally have been lost in top space, and I where I had to be mindful and pull myself out of it because I don't feel that the level of safety that I wanted to ensure I was able to do when I didn't have control of my own brain, so to say. So it's such a for me personally, it's such a slippery slope as a top to maintain control of the bottom and myself at the same time and still get that fulfillment of loss of self.
Yeah. So I have two things to say to this. First, just I want to thank you for noting and also just say I admire that you're actually thinking about this. You're not prioritizing your own experience too much as you're prioritizing the safety of the dynamic. Second, I would say when I have measured very experienced rope tops, what I've seen is they're strategic about when they lean in and allow themselves to give up control. I'll share a screen for another second here. This was an experienced rope top who was doing Ichinawa, playing with one rope. And you can see the red is this gamma band activity associated with arousal, especially in the back of the head. And when he's tying, there's very little. He tensions the rope, and then when he's untension, and especially while he's untying, that's where he's allowing that arousal to come in. You
Mm,
see brain activity alpha, sort of this brain idling, meditative leaning in, coming in when he's untying and when he's opening up the rope um, and allowing himself not even to have contact with the rope. Maybe he's just holding on to the person he's tied. Um, then when he disrupts that, again, all of that goes away. So the take home from that I would suggest is we can be strategic, we can choose when we're leaning in, and maybe those are times not to keep our hands so busy. Maybe we could stop. And when the rope top stops tying, you see brain synchronize and you see leaning in, especially during unties where it might be less dangerous and more just about mutual reactivity. That's another time where leaning in is really lovely. I think a lot of people minimize the experience of the untie with rope or untying. And at least for me, that's I've started tying a lot of the time for the untie. I tie specifically for what untying will be like as a dynamic and how we're going to experience that together.
I I really appreciate that thought because this is something that just over the last few years I personally have found so much value in the untying process and how it was pointed out to me by a bystander that it was very beautiful when I untied, and it looked very intimate, and we looked lost in each other were some of the words, and it was just like, "Wait a second, I wasn't thinking," and this is where I think at the point that I personally am, maybe I'm biased, probably am, is when I tie, a lot of it is unconscious competency. So the time that I'm allowed to slip away is in that untying process. And I didn't really connect it until you helped me connect it there. It,
Yeah,
I
this
think
is
I might have to
exactly what we've
appreciate it
seen
more.
with a lot of we've seen this with a lot of tying pairs, is that untying is time for them to connect. It's often described as very intimate, and it's often described as, in some sense, less technical. And when you're allowing yourself to be less technical, you can afford to lean in a bit more.
Absolutely. And I like the for me, it's like almost the climax, right? It's the final release of the experience.
Yeah. I think in pattern ties, it often is the final release. If you look at something like one rope work, Ichinawa, it's part and parcel of the rest of the tie, right? You're tying while you're untying, or you're untying for a few seconds, and then you tie something else and you untie something else. And that can make for a very nice dialogue. One example I often use is neck rope, where the tie with neck rope is often fairly quick and very technical. In contrast, people love the feeling often of rope running across their neck. And you can play with that in very safe ways during the untie because you're decreasing tension, if anything. And it's all about the movement, and it's all about the intimacy of hovering around someone's neck with something that is touching them.
I am a fan of neck rope. I joke that you should only do neck rope if it's really, really hot and in front of a few of your friends, right? Um, but I want to pause for a second and step back because we do have a couple questions that have popped up in the chat, and I think this is a pretty good one right here. Um, is can you see the difference between desire and arousal in the brain?
That's a really interesting question. Let me give you three words: desire, which is associated with reward anticipation, and that's a dopaminergic process. Reward receipt, which is having the thing you want and liking it, and that's often an opioid process. And then arousal, which goes on top of all of that. It could be good or bad, or almost orthogonal. So I could have desire with low arousal, or I could have desire with high arousal. That desire is could be something as simple as anticipating something nice will happen. There's a Japanese word, wak wak, which is the anticipation that something good is around the corner. We don't even have the word in English, but that's this dopaminergic process that um, is not climactic usually. It's everything leading up. Then, and often is associated with arousal building as that desire builds and as we get closer to anticipating something around the corner. Often with reward receipt, we get what we want, or something like orgasm, where it really is the end product. Similarly with food, you're anticipating eating food, and then when you actually eat it, you do get this opioid response. You feel good for a moment, and then kind of you're done. And often arousal after that decreases precipitously with satiety.
Very interesting. Um, very, very interesting. So I don't want to get lost into too much because we still have a few questions I want to cover, and there's still a few more questions in the chat. So as much as I want to dive farther down, with the respect of our time, let's let's see how many questions we can get answered. So another question that we have in the chat is, so we'll just read the whole actual comment. So being tied feels like being transported into a different realm of consciousness, and also a hyper awareness of my body and desire be a good communicator for my top. Is there a similar balance on the being tied side?
So being tied feels like these things. Is there a similar balance on the tying
So
side?
yeah, I think that there's a typo because it sounds like originally they're starting to say that being tied promotes these feelings, and I think they're asking if there's the similar feelings on the top side.
Yeah, yeah. So I want to give a brain mechanism for these two things that the person has said, which is really cool. There's a brain area called the anterior insula. It's kind of over here. Um, and it's involved in perceiving our body. When our body reacts in a way that our attention is drawn to it, like if rope is tensioned around us and we're like, I feel constricted now, and that's changing how I'm breathing. Um, it increases our attention to our body, the insula turns on, and that changes our consciousness. In particular, we get effects like time dilation, where time might slow down and our experience of our body can become very distorted. So we might feel longer or compressed or shorter or something. And we might become hyper aware of, for example, any little hair moving on our skin. Um, so yeah, so that's all introceptive activity, we call it. On the top side, on the person tying, we haven't looked as much for it, but I can tell you about analogous places where we have seen, which is in athletes who are, for example, trying to pitch a perfect game or bowl a perfect game, or archers. They have incredible levels of introceptive activity. As, for example, they're syncing their breathing with their shots in archery, or positioning their body just so. So, to the extent that tying is like these other things we know, where you're very precise with your movements, you're planning exactly how you're going to be doing things manually. Yeah, I would expect that the experience of higher insular activity and thus higher introception is very similar. This is great.
They lost me. They couldn't hear me. I keep trying. We have a little bit of an echo, and we were experiencing that before. I'm not sure what else to do. I've tried everything on my end.
Let
Um,
me turn you down in my side, and I'll see if that helps.
okay.
Try now.
Well, we will see. Some of the audience was saying there was a little bit of a feedback or possibly even a latency issue, but I would speculate that might not be the issue. I would imagine you have a reliable internet connection in modern society. Um, so we have a question, and I'm gonna butcher this word, but I'm hoping that you're gonna understand it. Is did you do any studies with rope and gel gel gelatology? Or do you think that rope affects our humor during scenes?
Say again.
The word is spelled Gelotology. Gelotology.
Ah, okay, laughter.
That made me think of a
So,
different class I seen where you did with clown and had her on a model train track set. That was a good
yeah,
class.
yeah. So we've done a bunch with absurdity and laughter and rope. In terms of formal studies, I actually haven't done too much with it. What I have done is look at how the affect or the emotion of the person who is tying is affecting the emotion of the person being tied. And there's often some level of feedback between them. So if the person who is tying is showing a lot of positive affect, positive emotion, whether that's smiling or laughing, that's going to translate to the person who is being tied. And all of a sudden, they're going to have a positive emotional experience, unless it explicitly, for example, mean spirited. Um, Similarly, if the person who is being tied is laughing and happy, you will see that emotion contagion. And the word that we'd want there is emotion contagion. And it'll transfer back to the person who is tying. I am, for lack of a better word, they talk about stone sexual lesbians, where my experience of arousal is often based on somebody else's experience of arousal. I love tying somebody and they're laughing, and then vicariously I experience that. And that's where my own arousal comes from. I love being tied by a top who is laughing and smiling, because that will transfer to me, and that contagion effect is very strong.
So it sounds like there's like a strong mirroring effect.
Yes, yes, quite often with highly emotional things. I will also give you that laughing can bias how we interpret our own arousal. So, for example, if we do something painful and arousal goes up, if the top is then very stern, or the person who's tying is very stern while you have that high arousal, it might bias you to going to a very negative place. And you could be thinking about, I'm in so much pain and this is difficult. In concert, my primary partner who I do this stuff with, if she decides to laugh about it, and especially to laugh about my pain, all of a sudden, a lot of that pain arousal is converted to joy very quickly. And it becomes a lot of fun because we can almost both laugh at the extent to which I'm hurt.
I think a good word here, and it's been dropped in chat, is the energy transfer that happens in a lot of this, right? And the flow back and forth. And it's like I've talked about it, whether it be like my top energy or my dom energy, how it helps feed that bottom energy, and that bottom energy feeds, and it's a very, I really have always gravitated to that exchange word because it just always really made sense to me personally.
Yeah, yeah. And whether you call it energy exchange or emotion contagion that psychologists like to use, it's, I think, very similar concepts. Lynn Worth and I used to have a series of dialogues we called Neuroscience Meets Woo, where she would use, some energy language, and I would say, here's the analogous psychological concept, and they snap on very well often enough.
I'm quite familiar with Linworth. They're a wonderful human. They're local. So
Yes. Yeah.
we have one more question in chat, and then we'll get back into our interview questions, and then we'll probably pause questions until the end of the interview. So the question that we have for you is, have you studied the brain when the bottom enjoys trying to escape from rope? If so, what have you discovered? Does it affect the top? I think a common term, at least that I've heard, is eeling.
Right. So I've done very little with that. The people I've measured have been, for lack of a better word, generally uninterested in it. the What I will say is, I have looked a bunch at the extent to which the person tying and the person being tied have the same collaborative goals versus when their goals diverge. If they have the same collaborative goals and are celebrating each other's accomplishments, like, oh, you tied me really well and I can't escape, or oh, you're escaping and this is great, I love how you're doing that, then their emotions are a positive feedback loop and you can see them both leaning in, and it's again this high trance, high arousal experience for both of them. In contrast, when their goals diverge, for example, one person wants to tie tighter and the other person wants to get out, you get a lot of brain signatures of conflict. There's a brain area called the anterior cingulate, which is associated with response conflict. Like you see the word red written in blue, and you're set color. The anterior cingulate becomes very active, and when the top and bottom, where the person tying and being tied, don't align, you get a lot of what looks like that cingulate activity as they have to now navigate, and that's a cognitive process. They pull back any transient arousal and they have to communicate, and it can go in any number of ways. That singular activity often provokes a lot of negative emotion. So it can be turned to fear for the person who is being tied, frustration for the person who's tying, if the communication isn't strong at that point.
That's a reminds me of a previous experience that I had, and it's made me more intentional with my communication. So for instance, like when we're talking about eeling, right? Sounds like to me when intentions align, then the experience is rewarding and like you said, that positive feedback loop. And when I play in certain areas, I'm very explicit that I am playing to win and I want to play with people that play to lose. And where I win is based off of the reaction of the interaction of that person that I'm playing with the goal of me winning, them losing. And especially if you get into like some primal, and we're not going to like dive into that, like I think you have to be even more intentional. And going back to the eeling as a top, like that's fairly competent in rope at this point. If I don't want you to get out, you probably won't without some form of risk that we don't want. Um, but I think for me personally is like I want to find that line of it's hard for them to get out. They have to be creative and struggle a little bit. But for me as a top, I actually when I do the eeling, I want my bottom to get out because the reward and that they get out of it and to see them lighten up that they think they won, it's very rewarding for me.
Yeah,
Um
and so that's goals are aligned, and which means you can both enjoy the process. If you've tied them in a way where they're probably going to injure themselves to get out, and then they start trying to eel, that's going to be safety concerns for you, and you're going to be worried, and your head's not going to be at all in the celebrating them game. So I would imagine there's a lot of misalignment at that point between the brains.
Absolutely, and, like, when I think about, like, that tying where you can't get out, I think of, like, specifically Jitsu, where, like, this is
Yeah,
these ties were designed to be inescapable without some level of risk that most of us aren't willing to take, either as a top or a
yeah.
bottom. Wow. All right, let's get back to our interview questions because the next one is one that I've been like kind of excited to ask you about, and you even said that it's going to be a little bit of speculation. But I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on it. And it's how does rope bondage affect the levels of oxytocin, the hormone that's associated with trust and social bonding inside of rope?
So, as I mentioned to you before, I can start with we don't know. It's hard to measure, and we really haven't. But I can offer you some speculation. The first one is that it's not always the same. It's a lot about the intention in the scene and the story you're telling about it. If you're going in with an intention of intimate, trusting rope that is there to reinforce a bonded dynamic, I could very easily imagine that oxytocin would increase. In contrast, if it's a new pair tying or one person is not particularly trusting the other, you see oxytocin in context of trust, and you'll get less of it. So I can give you a few more bits of information. Oxytocin is a lot about pair bonding. Um, and so if it's a scene with a lot of bonding between the person tying and being tied, we would expect oxytocin to go up. If it's a more sexual scene, we would especially expect oxytocin to go up. In particular, breast stimulation, genital stimulation is associated a lot with that release of oxytocin. So we would expect that to go up. Um, when once oxytocin goes up, we see fear decrease, amygdala activity associated with fear decreases. We see a lot more brain synchrony when there's more oxytocin. And there's one other thing that happens, which again you could be intentional about, which is when there is more oxytocin released, rejection sensitivity decreases.
Mhm.
So if you want somebody to be very sensitive to abandonment and rope, I might suggest starting with a less intimate scene that is less rich in oxytocin so that they really feel it when you walk away from them. In contrast, if you want rejection sensitivity to not be part of your scene, you could do things that are more likely to provoke oxytocin. Um, something more intimate, more holding. Some people say if you hold each other for 45 seconds, it increases oxytocin, or as I say, sexual touch. There is one other thing I will mention. I won't say dangerous to say on a podcast as much as definitely edge play, which is that intranasal oxytocin is a thing that you can actually just manipulate. Um, Walmart.com sells under a brand called OxyPure, straight up intranasal nose spray oxytocin, and you can experiment with the effects of oxytocin and say this is what it looks like when my partner's oxytocin goes up or down, and you can compare that to what rope does.
Hmm.
We've done that a bunch, and indeed, I take intranasal oxytocin. My rejection sensitivity does go way down. My interpretation of pain is as an intimate experience rather than a rejected, difficult experience. Um, and I find ways to think that this tie is probably good for me with intranasal oxytocin on board.
Interesting. So it sounds like that with aligned intentions, that rope has the capability on a hormonal level to be very connecting and very bonding.
I would psychologically, a lot of people describe that. I would expect that that's the hormonal result. Again, we haven't measured it, but it seems very likely to me. Um,
Mm.
I will mention something that is kind of important in that regard, which is that rope can provoke all sorts of reactions in us that are not necessarily representative of our feelings for a person. So, certain kinds of rope could provoke feelings of closeness, as you've suggested, potentially through oxytocin release or other mechanisms. And we end up feeling closer to a person, and it wasn't as a function of them being a good person. It's just the rope. One example I will give you, which often works this way, is cognitive dissonance. If you are allowing somebody to tie you in intimate ways, um, in especially in more sexual rope, you are faced with a choice, which is you could tell a story that says, "I have just been violated, and that's very difficult for me," or and that's very uncomfortable, and we like to avoid uncomfortability. So you might tell yourself the story, "Oh, I liked that, and I feel very close to this person, and I trust them a lot now." And that's a lot easier to swallow for you. And the result is, again, you come off feeling much closer to this person. You come away feeling like now I trust them and I'm intimate with them, and it could have all of these hormonal consequences. And really, it was cognitive dissonance helping you tell that story.
Wow. I'm looking back through some of my rope experiences now and applying some of this data. Um,
Yeah.
uh-oh. I I personally have a great experience to share when it comes to this. So I used to be a service top at a large event in Columbus called Trauma, and you have a couple minutes to negotiate with more than likely someone very new to rope, very, very new to rope, more than likely. And one of the things that I mentioned in my side of the negotiations was after they got out of rope, if they were a femme presenting person, that they were not allowed to kiss me. And most of them kind of looked at me a little bit funny. But after a couple of years of topping at Trauma, I had a couple people make a pass at me. And I'm like, you don't like me. You like the rope, right? I don't know what you're feeling right now, but it's not towards me, it's towards the rope. And so, like I said, some people looked at me a little weird when I expressed that prior to rope. And it was kind of rewarding that after I tied them, there was a handful of people that said, wow, I didn't understand at first, but after like I got out of suspension, I had this strange connection to you.
Yeah. Yeah. So the phenomenon there and the word for it we use is misattributed arousal.
Mm.
It comes from a series of experiments quite a while ago where they had people read a getting to know you script and then said, "How much do you like each other?" And it was not very much. They had them read the same getting to know you script on a bridge 40 feet in the air that was swaying. All of a sudden, they fell in love just from reading the getting to know you script because the arousal was so high in the context of that activity, and they attributed it to liking each other.
I can't. Wow, I'm really blown away because, like I said, it made sense, but it was just my personal experience, not necessarily understanding why, right? But it was something that as I've tied more and more people, I've kind of been blunt. Like you don't love me, you love the rope. You don't like me, you like the rope, and that's not a problem necessarily, right? But to make sure that those attentions align.
So I think that it's critical what you're saying, and I think the other thing it speaks to, I got into these presentations in the context of education for people who were being tied, because a lot of people were saying, I have all these experiences. My brain goes places I don't understand. Why is that? What's that about? And I really would like to have the message out there that if you are being tied in rope, understanding what you're getting into and the kind of changes you expect could be very important and useful, so that when you experience this stuff, it's like, oh, yeah, what I like about this is the rope. I'm going to kiss the rope.
Mm. Yeah, and it's like you don't know what you don't know, and uh,
Yep.
it's taken me a very long time to realize some of the mm, correct me if I'm wrong, but the physiological effects that it has on me personally as a top, whether that is sexual energy or sexual arousal or various stimulation inside of my brain on a very low road space. And this is where over the last few years I've had to be more mindful and more responsible when it comes to this, because something that I realized is that I've found myself slipping further into top space when it comes to a long-term partner, especially when both of our intentions align with very dynamic, challenging rope. It's like finding that line of where I can go safely with them and like where um I can get escape into that top space, and that's where for me personally why I enjoy tying with long-term partners, because I feel more comfortable because I know them better. I know their intentions, I know their body, I know their mind a little bit better. Now I'm not a mind reader, I'm not a medical doctor, but it allows me to experience that more um connected or intimate experience by far. And that leads us right into the next question, because for me, a lot of this, and this is being rope, it boils down to the natural authority that is transferred inside of rope, at least for me and my perspective, and with my intentions. So the next question that I have for you is, how does rope bondage influence the dynamics of dominance and submission?
Right. So this is a really interesting question. And I would refer a lot to what we've just been talking about. We don't have formal studies. We don't have studies where we measure the relationship before and after. I've done some of that with other things that are similar. We published a large study of clitoral stroking, where it turns out that if one person is the stroker and one person is the strokee, and you do 15 minutes of clitoral stroking, gosh, the relationship gets closer and they feel more bonded together, um, for whatever that's worth. But what we can say is that rope can likely influence how people interpret their joint experiences. I have been tied by somebody and it's worked out well, and we interacted in a comfortable, safe, intimate way. I could imagine our dynamic being reinforced as closer or more intimate. In contrast, if I experienced a lot of distrust and a lot of fear, we encode these things. At times of high arousal, we encode our experiences more strongly.
Mm,
And so that's what I now experience with that person. And it could be dynamic, um, not reinforcing. Um, the two concepts we've just talked about, cognitive dissonance, whereby I am going to interpret things in a comfortable light if I can, will tend to make rope experiences more dynamic reinforcing. And misattributed arousal will make high arousal experiences more likely to draw me close to somebody, and that could again be dynamic reinforcing. My D type uses these constantly, where it's like, let's do things that are more dynamic reinforcing by creating these high arousal, often painful, uncomfortable situations where she's in the role of rescuer. And that often works out to reinforce our dynamic very strongly.
Um, I don't recall exactly off the top of my head, and I didn't wanna look through all of my notes, but a couple weeks ago, we interviewed Slut PhD, um, AKA IP Cookie Monster, and they have a
Yeah.
PhD in sociology, and wow, that was a great discussion as well, and something that they brought up in that discussion as and I'm probably gonna butcher it because I am definitely not a PhD in sociology, but I believe how they framed it was that we're more likely to create a traumatic experience inside of our brain when we are in moments of vulnerability, such as rope. What are your thoughts on that?
So I usually tend to agree with IP Cookie Monster on their observations. They're just a real good judge of experience. Uh, Clearly, at vulnerable times where I'm thinking, "Am I safe here?" It could very easily go to, "No, I'm not safe." The same brain areas that do reward to punishment and that evaluate safety, evaluate things as threatening. And if I'm evaluating things as threatening and remember how threatening it was, it could very easily turn into a trauma memory. Um, I think it depends on how we were feeling at the time. There's a brain circuit between an area of the brain called the amygdala, which is associated a lot with fear and emotional reactivity and seeing things as salient and important, and the hippocampus, which does memory. And so emotional things activate the amygdala a lot, which means that the hippocampal memory encoding becomes very strong, which reactivates the amygdala, which reactivates the memory, makes that a loop. We think that's a lot what happens in trauma memories, is you get these sort of fear loops when you think about something. If in contrast, you have the same experience of interesting, difficult rope where you're both laughing about it and it's joyful and fun and intimate and reinforcing. When I think about that memory, that's what's going to come back. And that context may be self reinforcing and not traumatic at all.
So it sounds like a lot of it has to do with frame, right? The frame of mind. And going back to
Yep.
even intention. And so, like, something a great way that I framed rope to newer people is rope is a spectrum, and a good way to think about it is like genres of movie, right? Is this a romance? Is this a horror? Is this a comedy? Is this a suspense? Right? Um, Now obviously rope can be a lot more than that, but to make sure that, like, the intentions of the genre of what type of rope we're trying to do, I think it helps encourage having, like, what you're saying, these positive experiences and these positive memories inside of rope.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And I think setting that intention up front can bias you to create things that are not trauma. I
Mm,
will say my D type really likes playing with her own fear reactions. And so we often do ties that are very precarious, that could be quite traumatic, except that we have so much of a context of safety and a context of fun and a context of her knowing that she's in control the whole time, that she can lean into the fear reaction and not feel traumatized by it at the end of the day.
I
But
that
again, the other thing I would point out is just this idea up at higher arousal, these things become very plastic. So if you're going to raise the arousal that high and create fear, it could go either way. So we're just doubling down on really reinforcing the joyful aspects of it, so you can have fear and joy coexisting rather than becoming traumatic.
that makes sense. I mean, like, for me, I've personally had a few experiences where, like, don't wanna use the word healing, but I will use the word, like, cathartic, right? And, where there's been a huge release either on my end or to be honest, more often on the bottom's end, at least from my experience.
Mhm.
So so we'll go into the next question. We're just gonna keep firing them. We got a couple in chat that maybe we can get at the end, but we are, a little over an hour at this point, and I do wanna be mindful of your time. So the next question that we have is, what are the neural mechanisms behind trust, surrender, and control?
Right. So in the brain, trust is associated a lot with decreased activity in this fear network. It's associated with increased synchrony between people, someone doing something and something being done to them. And that happens especially in the presence of more oxytocin. So if it's high trust, high oxytocin, you're going to get more synchrony, more um, decrease in fear and amygdala reactivity. Um, I would say a lot of the rest, the control we've talked about, this is this prefrontal mechanism associated with planning and regulating our emotions. And how much we want to give that up is a decision process. If we've negotiated that while being tied, the goal is to fully react and experience, often people are very good at giving up control, and that's what they do. In, context, in contrast, it's more of an acrobatic tie where, you know, push and see how far you can stretch while I facilitate that with. It may be very little giving up control and more both people preserving a lot of control. As you've mentioned, often the person tying has a whole lot of control for safety reasons and simply traditional reasons, that's the dynamic people choose. But again, as you've said, untying times where you can lean in, we can be choosing to give that up. Final piece I'll give you is this narrative piece. It's what you make of it. So surrender. If I've decided this is a tie about surrender, then that's the framework I'll put on it. and I may lean in and I may give up control. And if they've decided it's not, then I'm going to be feisty and fighting and preserve all the control. I might have more anger reactivity than fear reactivity.
That's a great point. I mean, and it keeps going back to like a lot of what this discussion has been about, that a lot of how our body responds is based off of the communications and the intentions that we set out with. I know
Yep.
for me that I have tied a lot of single mothers specifically, or maybe not single mothers, but mothers, right? Specifically. And it is very empowering for them to be put in these pretty shapes and feel beautiful and all the things. I don't think that for a lot of the people I tie, there may be a layer of surrender, but that's not what the intention is. And I think that's where a lot of the feedback that I've got is more that it is empowering. Now, when I'm tying with my person, a long-term partner, someone that I have negotiated authority over, then it tends to be a little bit more about surrender.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. Some days with the people I tie with, we're tying for pretty and empowering. And um, there's one person I tie with a bunch who just loves to feel like a superhero. And we tie them in cool shapes and poses, and we take pictures, and they always come out like a superhero, and it's great. Um, and then other people, it really is. I want a time where I don't have to think, and I want to let go, and I want you to hold space for whatever I'm feeling, and or I want to play with my own fear reactivity. And at that point, sure, then it becomes about surrender more, but that's the intention set. I think a lot of times when people say it was a bad rope experience, it's when the experience of the rope doesn't match the preset intention. So if I thought this was about empowerment and being pretty, and all of a sudden it becomes something where someone's trying to control me and get me to surrender, that's not going to go very well.
Mm.
When both the person tying and the person being tied are aligned in intentions, that often goes really well.
I completely agree with that. As the that bad experience, a lot of times it's simply when the expectations were not met. And I think almost every podcast that I've had since I've heard it, I've brought this quote into it by Chris Williamson, I believe. It says, unspoken expectations are hidden resentments. And I really, really like that for so many reasons. And that's where, like, going back to setting the intentions for the rope scene is some of it is to setting that expectations. If I'm expecting you to surrender, I'm gonna push you till you surrender. And for me to ethically do that, I probably better communicate that I'm gonna push you until you surrender, because otherwise I probably, knowing me, will push you over because I'm trying to get that surrender. And if you don't know that I'm trying to achieve that, then I might, instead of the I might kick in the fight and flight response, and you might start genuinely fighting me, and I think it's supposed to be sexy fighting, and you're not fighting to lose at that point.
Yeah. The other thing that is a very real thing we've seen on a number of occasions is people going to a shutdown place. So if, for example, somebody doesn't intend to surrender and someone is pushing them that way, they may just opt out emotionally. And you get dissociative reactions where, again, the insula, that part of the brain that pays attention to the body, shuts down. And mostly what you get is unreactivity. This could be interpreted wrongly as surrender, like, oh, they become passive and still. um, there used to be a disciplinary technique where you would hug somebody until they stopped struggling, and they thought this was surrender, and really it was people shutting down. Um, and it was traumatic. And if you want to talk about trauma-inducing rope, like that's a really good recipe for it. Push somebody to dissociate, push somebody to shut down, and all of a sudden you've created trauma.
Correct me if I'm wrong, that would be considered the fawn response, right?
I would not suggest it's a fawn response. It's free, if anything, more like a freeze response. Like fawn is usually let me do things to get your affection, where it's shutting down is yeah, I'm out of here. Like
Okay.
sometimes you'll be tying somebody and you think things are going okay, and they're highly aroused, and all of a sudden they've got their eyes glazed over and they're paying attention and they're just not into it anymore. What happened is they opted out emotionally because they were not prepared or not consenting to the kind of an emotional experience that was being had. And that can be a conscious thing or it can be an automatic thing. This we got too close to some trauma that was before them. They sort of opted out.
So this might be just a whole can of worms, but I just want to ask it. Um, if a top unintentionally created this shutdown, this emotional shutdown, is there anything that a top can reasonably do in this situation to help bring this person back and make them whole?
Yeah, yeah. So that's a great question. What I would say is the correct time to be asking it is before you tie. A lot of people know what brings them back. And I love asking people before I tie, hey, do you tend to dissociate? What does that look like for you? And what brings you back? What can I do? And people will often be like, oh, yeah, yeah, all you need to do is call me on my phone and I answer that right away. Or um, you just need to help ground me, touch me and be still and stop tying the rope or get the rope off of me. A lot of times people know. If people don't know, um, there are some good heuristics, which is create a context of safety, create a context of empowerment, create a context of listening, ask, what do you need? If somebody is really not responding, often giving them some space or untying could be useful. Um, it's a really hard call at that point. I will say there are a lot of things that do work, but negotiating it with somebody who knows themselves is a lot better than trying to figure it out in the moment.
I agree. There's an old, really, really old quote from Jay Wiseman. I can't remember exactly, but it's like the last time you want to be negotiating is when you have your person tied up and they're naked or something like that, right? That's not when you want
Yeah.
to figure out this stuff. Um, yeah, yeah, I think it's really important that on both sides of the slash that we take that responsibility. Like I actually have a writing not that long ago that safety is a shared experience, and like as a top, I have all kinds of forms and all kinds of questionnaires, and they're living documents and they've changed. I can't possibly ask every question. Um,
Right.
can only do my best, and like I can speak of a few times where you don't know where you don't know, and until you don't know what you don't know, you never will know. Um,
Oh, there is one thing I can say doesn't help, which is if somebody dissociates, if you're tying them, try and not be butthurt about it. Seriously, if you get resentful and you're like, why are you doing this to me and all of that, I've never seen that one go well. It
I would
reinforces the negative affect in the room, and it's every reason for somebody to retreat further. So becoming more centered around the experience of the person who's being tied can help for everyone.
when I think this goes into like, I'm gonna say like emotional responsibility that a top should have. And this is where like when I tie with people, I encourage them to have a voice. And when I help
Yep.
mentor new tops, I tell them like the key to being a good rigger is to encourage your bottom to communicate with you and use that feedback loop because every bottom's going to be different. A TK is going to sit different here on this person. They may prefer a higher band, a lower band, all the things, right? Um, hmm. And yeah, we can get lost in that. So let's get back on track. We got a couple more questions, and so my next question that I have for you is what are some of the benefits and the risk of rope bondage for mental health and physical health? And I mean, this is just a really big question. So we don't need to like cover all the bases, but like some more specific to your personal experience, whether it's professional or just inside of the rope community.
Yeah. So I would say the first answer there is we don't know. We haven't done the studies. The second answer is that this is very political. I don't want to call rope therapy. I don't want to say you should introduce rope into your healing practices if you're a practitioner. I'm not going to recommend that you do rope with your clients or something like that. Um, but I can say that there are a number of features of rope that intersect interestingly with health protective and health negative practices. Um, for example, trust is often health protective, and rope does facilitate trust sometimes, where it could go the other way, as we've discussed. Psychological resetting is an interesting concept. We believe that chronic pain is often misinterpretation of body signals. That is, say, the body is sending an errant pain signal that doesn't represent real pain. One of the therapies we have for chronic pain is showing the body, oh, this is what actual pain is looking like, so you don't have to misinterpret these other cues you're sending as pain. Um, Frequently, with my D type, use really uncomfortable scenes as psychological reset for me, so I'm not interpreting the world as so difficult because Sunday morning I learned exactly what really difficult feels like for me. And tomorrow when somebody looks at me funny, it's like, oh yeah, that's nothing. Um, we kind of know that thunder vests work. Chest compression is something that's been studied in animals and people, and chest compression can be very centering for people um, in interesting ways if you use it consensually in ways that what we know it does is increases parasympathetic tone. It's the brain's rest and digest system that helps people adaptively regulate their emotions. Um, and then finally, I'll just mention reclaiming spaces of discontrol. That is to say, often, for example, especially after some trauma, feeling like we're out of control can be very unsafe. Having our own intense emotions and sitting with them can feel very unsafe. And a lot of people have told me they've used rope as an experience whereby they learn to understand their brains and body's reactions on their terms. And working with somebody they trust in the context of rope or BDSM or even just emotional engagement resets their ability to interact, trust their own brain body. So it can have these effects. I'm suggesting that it can also be dangerous and just not assume that rope will have these effects as much as some people have observed it happens for them sometimes. And for every benefit done with weird intentions or not consensual, mismatched expectations, you can have the exact risks that would be the opposite of the gains you get from it.
That makes sense. I mean, and I think like that question goes back to like most of what this conversation has been, and a lot of it has been making sure that intentions are aligned, and then that's how you're gonna encourage those positive experiences, um, and mitigate the risk, right? One of my key or catchphrases is that most of what we do isn't safe. All we can do is mitigate the risk through education and communication. Um, and then there's probably
Yeah.
more to it than that, right? But it's risky for me to walk down the 4 steps that go out of this building, right? But, if there's ice on there and I put salt, that's a way I can mitigate risk, and I'm not gonna get lost in the analogy, but that's all we can do, especially when it comes to rope play. Rope play specifically is considered one of the more dangerous things that we do. And then when we're talking about some of the psychological effects or the mental aspects that are to some level inherent to rope play, the edge gets a lot sharper. It's easy
Mhm.
to see the physical responses from the interactions that we have from as a top with a bottom. It's really hard to see when this rope scene's going really great, everybody's laughing, everybody's having a good time, and then all of a sudden, one word, one action that nobody could have thought of was said or done, and then it puts somebody into an emotional shutdown.
Yeah, yeah. And again, I'd come back to this model whereby at times of high arousal, positive and negative, very plastic, and one can easily flip into the other if everybody is not working super hard to hold the space, and also keeping, and also if everything's not going perfectly right. So you could have people having a great high arousal time, somebody twists wrong, and their wrist gets hurt in a way they don't want it to, and all of a sudden, all that high arousal positive emotion is converted to high arousal negative emotion. Um, Other risks, just to mention, are the level of power differential can really be amplified by these things like cognitive dissonance and misattributed arousal, where it's easy to be taken advantage of in these vulnerable states. And as IT Cookie Monster said, you end up with a trauma that you did not bargain for.
Hmm. I like that term, like the plasticity of like how these experiences are remembered and how hmm, I don't know if this is the correct word, but how fragile it is and how really easy that experience can tip one way or another. So I guess like I have a little bit of a question on that is what happens if like in that moment, you know, the perceived experience is positive, but then after some time for various whatever reason, now the experience is perceived as negative. What do you think? I mean, I don't, I'm trying to think of what the question really is here. I guess, like, what do you speculate could be the cause of that? But more so, what do you speculate could be a solution to that?
So I would say it's unfortunately all too common. You have some high arousal experience, which is perceived as positive moment because, for example, you thought the scene was being executed with one intention. You learn later that it was actually being executed with some other intention, and that colors your memory of it. And now you've interpreted it very differently. Um, I actually think the process of reinterpreting our experiences to reclaim bad experiences as something we learn and grow from, or to reclaim things that were seemed good as actually fairly dangerous for us. That's part of living and gaining experience. As to what the solution is, I'm not sure I would suggest there is or that we need a solution as much as we can know that it will happen.
Mm.
And I like that framework because it now gives us a negotiating point of suppose when does the scene end and when does my responsibility for the scene end? We think that the scene went great. I checked in right after. I checked in 2 days later. We were all fine. 6 months later, you feel like it went terribly wrong. Whose responsibility is it at that point? What if we actually had negotiated that? What if we talked about what do we do if I start feeling and thinking differently about this? I've come to believe that that longer term consideration is something to negotiate or at least to discuss upfront. We're going to have an emotional experience. Linworth and I were always fond of saying, you're after a rope experience, your relationship is going to change. You don't know exactly how, and you don't know the time course on which it's going to change, but something's going to happen.
Mm.
And what if we're, by agreeing to engage in a high arousal emotional experience, we're engaging in, we're going to have a long ride with this one. I think it might cause us to think differently about who and when we play with, what our negotiations will be, and what our responsibility is thereafter.
Mm. I really, really like that negotiating for the length of responsibility. That is that's really good in my opinion. Um, because when does my responsibility stop? As a rope top, if 6 months or 6 years on an extreme situation, if that experience somehow changed because of some other influence, how can I realistically or reasonably be responsible unless if it's negotiated for, where it's like, hey, in 6 years or whatever it may be, if you feel some different type of way about this consensual experience, then you have the ability and the autonomy to reach out and communicate with me about it so we can make sure that this experience stays. I don't know if that's the way to frame it, but like to make sure that it remains as a positive experience, especially if it's been positive for, and in this extreme example, 6 years.
Or at least if it's become negative, we can talk about it maybe.
Fair.
Because I don't believe it's anyone's responsibility to try and change things to always stay positive. But I could say, hey, look, if you're starting to feel negative about this, I would love the chance to actually talk to you about it and hear what you're going through because I don't want you to have to go through that alone.
I like how you worded that, right? And I think that's really important to allow that space to communicate about the potential change of negative experience. And more so, I really appreciated how you said that you didn't want someone to go through that alone. That shows a very high level of compassion and responsibility that I think should be extended whether at top or bottom. Oh, wow. Okay. So we are like exhausting, the time commitments. And I told you I'd try to keep it to about an hour and a half. We're already right about there, but I have two more questions I'd really like to get out if you don't mind, if you have the time and the energy.
Sure.
Okay. So the next question I have is, can you explain what frenzy looks like from a neuroscience standpoint? And for anybody that's not clear what frenzy is, it's usually a state, either a dom or a sub is, I think the way I would frame it, and I'd appreciate you framing it in maybe a more intelligent way, is becomes quite impulsive, and has impulsive behavior to do all of the things as fast as possible.
Right. And again, what I would say, we don't have studies of frenzy. We haven't looked at it
Yeah,
under a
yeah.
microscope yet. But we do have some other models. Remember, we talked about the separation biologically of wanting from having. Wanting is a dopamine process, having it is an opioid process. A lot of times in addiction, people become filled with want for a thing, and having is no longer even the goal. It's I just want and want and want more. That's this runaway dopamine process. And to me, that looks a lot like frenzy, where my wanting system is in overdrive. If I don't get it, it could be very upsetting for me. And these are dashed expectations, which we know is a big washout of dopamine. So if I expect something's going to happen and I don't get it, dopamine, the rug is pulled out from under me and I'm bereft, which again sounds like frenzy. Impulsive behaviors, again, often thought to be dopaminergically mediated. It looks to me like you've just got your dopamine, your reward system, reward anticipation, and reward system in overdrive. So I just want more of the stuff. And you, it's associated with being willing to do risky things, being willing to take bad gambles, being highly motivated to do, for example, sexually promiscuous things. Um, yeah, so that's the sort of model I would use.
Yeah. I I definitely can admit that I've been in various stages of frenzy. Usually how my frenzy tends to manifest is um unquenchable thirst for knowledge. And like I will, once I'm like, okay, whatever I'm getting into, whether it's, like strapatos, like I'm all over strapatos right now. And, I just want to do all the strapatos. And I'm, it's funny how you said like that expectation and that dopamine being ripped from me. One of my long-term bottoms, I got to tie with them last weekend. I actually got to tie with two of my long-term bottoms, and one of them is like, "Can we have strapato fun this weekend?" I'm like, "Yes, yes, we can." And the other one I've been tying now for almost 6 years, I think. I've never put them in a strapato. They love a TK. They do great in a TK, and we had a little bit of lab time, and they weren't going to do well in a strapato, in my opinion. And I really am visualizing where it kind of felt like that rug was pulled out of under me a little bit,
Mhm.
and hmm, interesting, very
So
interesting to think about that.
the other model I will give you, which it looks a bunch like, is a word that's been getting a lot of attention in the media lately, which is hyperfocus. Often people who have ADHD, who are autistic, do have a lot of hyperfocus, which is the ability to really zoom in on one thing and say, I want to think about and learn about only that one thing. And that thing can
Mm,
become, for a while, a special interest.
mm,
Um, and we've done a little bit of neuroscience around this. It looks like a big wanting state. It looks like a high reward state. So once something is becomes that hyper focused, that interesting, then it's very rewarding to engage with it, and it's familiar, and we elaborate our knowledge base around that thing. So the more we do it, the more we're playing in a very comfortable and for us rewarding sandbox. So it's almost virtuous cycle.
I um completely agree with the hyper focus, and I've spoke on this quite a bit specifically for me. I know I'm definitely ADD. I'm definitely neurodivergent. I've tested. I'm on the Asperger spectrum, autism spectrum. Um, and for
Me as
rope,
well.
it's one of the few times that the chaos in my brain it disappears. I get
Mhm.
this level of hyper focus that I don't know if I've ever experienced any other place in my life. There's a quote that's circulating around right now by Elon Musk that says most people wouldn't want to be me. They wouldn't want to be inside my brain. It is a storm. And I'm not saying I'm Elon, but I felt that like my brain is a storm. And whenever I come into rope, it's like the eye. Everything's really calm. My only purpose, maybe not to sound too cliche, is to keep this other human alive. I don't want to say safe, right? But like alive, breathing. And then there's probably a lot more that can stem from that depending on what's negotiated. But the rest of my brain, the rest of the world, just it's simply dissolves. And you know that BDSM or rope is not therapy, but it can be very therapeutic for me, very cathartic for me, especially when I find myself in my professional life getting more and more and more and more chaos because I joke that's my job is I manage chaos. I really and to seek those rope experience specifically with long-term partners because of that release of like my brain is silenced even if it's only for a moment.
And what I would come back to is this picture that we consistently see with experienced rogue people on both sides of the slash, this simultaneous high arousal, high trance picture, which is like a deep meditation. And show you my brain reactivity in monks who are 25-year meditators, and I can show you my rooftops and my rope bottoms, and you're going to tell me they look very, very similar.
I've explained it as like the world dissolves around me. I've
Hmm.
been known to be a performance rigger, and I've performed in front of hundreds of people, but it literally none of them are in the room, and it's really weird because I'm
Yep.
very introverted, and I actually have a fairly high level of social anxiety. But when I can get on that stage and I can get lost in my partner, I mean, like I'm not joking. It's where I've actually had to step back and remind myself that I'm in a room of 300 people or, 50 people or whatever it may be, right? That
Yep.
it's it's very trance-like for me. Um okay, so the last question, right? And this they're all doozies. They were all kind of big open-ended questions, which that's kind of what I wanted to dive really deep into some of this and maybe not necessarily go off of hard data, but speculation, right? Based off of
Mhm.
experience and observation. So, what are some of the common myths or misconceptions about rope bondage and the neuroscience behind it? How can we educate the public and the rope community about the science of rope?
Well, I'll give you a few, and they're going to be just recapitulating things we've said at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the idea that rope is a primarily physical process, to me, is a crazy myth. We've talked about the mental game of rope being so much of it. And this and so I would replace that with rope as a mind-body process. And even if you think you are just putting rope on someone physically, so there's no emotional connection, you don't get to make that decision.
Mm.
Um, if you shock a rat's foot and ask how long its arousal lasts, how long the amygdala reactivity lasts, that's upward of 4 hours. The rope scene doesn't end when you think it ends. People have the conception, oh, I've taken the rope off physically. I am not manipulating this person anymore. The scene must be over. In truth, the mental game is not over. And that may last a lot longer. As we've said, 4 hours for high arousal is not weird. But then, as you've mentioned, 6 months or a year later, they may still be reinterpreted. So, yeah, rope being primarily physical, first myth. Second myth that we've talked about, the person tying needs to be in complete control, and the person being tied needs to be completely out of it. I hope we've dismissed that in many ways now to say that it's a conversation.
Mhm.
Um, and that control is dynamic for both people, and it's an interacting story. The final myth I will well, yeah,
I
you're gonna
just
say?
I love how you put that, that rope is a conversation. Like, that is
Yeah.
spot on.
And then the final piece that I've alluded to a few times is that tying rope is inherently dominant. This is something you and I talked a little bit about, where we've said that tying rope is an action that will have an effect on another person, and that could be dictated by anyone in the dynamic. So my D type likes to be tied in a way that lets her experience fear. That is not dominant if I am tying her even in a way that gives her a fearful process. That is service topping, if anything, creating an experience that she would want to have. So I would rather say that there are intentions that could be dominant and there are intentions that could be more submissive. And those intentions can be carried out through whatever actions the people who are tying and being tied like to view them with. So, um, looking at rope then again as a vehicle to promote a conversation. One person's tying, one person is being tied. The psychological effects of that are what you make of it. And it's going to come back to the narratives you're telling and the negotiations you've had and how you listen to each other.
I agree. There's something, a real simple thing that put something in perspective for me some years ago. I was down at the woodshed in Orlando, and I seen someone that is a capped master inside of the leather community get flogged by one of his boys. I'll be honest, I was confused. And I went up to this person and I respectfully asked, "May I ask a few questions?" And long story short, this wonderful human was really blunt with me. And he was like, "Who do you think him told him to do that action?" It was my authority that allowed that action. It was because
Mhm,
my desire wanted that action. And that really made me think a lot. And I kind of go back to an old saying by, I believe, Master Skip Chasey, where he says, topping and embodying is about the physical body, dominance and submission is about the mental body, and master and slave is about the spiritual body. And that's worked really well for me. But honestly, through this conversation, I think there's a part that doesn't necessarily work super well for me anymore. And I'm gonna have to like suss out and reflect on this. I think that right now, I'm gonna word it this way, that dominance and submission has a lot to do with intention. So mental space and intention, right? That I am intentionally setting out to be dominant and create that dominant mental or head space. And that's something that sat with me for a very long time. So it's really crazy to think that, even after being in the community for however long I've been here, that it's a constant evolution, and my journey is always taking me somewhere new, and goes back to something I said off the air. Part of my goal with this podcast is to be the catalyst for the conversations that I want to hear. And wow, I would need to hear, and did I want to hear this conversation? It's been utterly amazing for me personally. Um, with that said, we have wrapped up through all of the questions that I proposed. As much as I'd like to go back and look at some of the comments, questions, I do want to go ahead and get this wrapped up for both our sakes. Um, we do have a simple question. You did share a little bit of your data on a screen share. Would you be willing to share that data with me where I'd be able to potentially post it in the show notes for any of our viewers that'd be interested in that?
Um, I would say share the video as we used it because I have gotten consent from the people who were tying and being tied to use it in presentations. They have not given consent for publication of that data to be distributed. I can go back and ask some of them,
That's
but I
completely
can't promise that.
reasonable. It's completely reasonable. Um, maybe the potential here to get this data, because I think a lot of people can benefit from it, is if we simply censored out names or any other kind of identifying features.
Again, I really feel like the people who gave of their brain and body for this
Mm.
kind of own that data. So I will ask them and we'll see.
I appreciate that. I absolutely 100% appreciate that and respect it, to be clear. Um, I guess I have a question for you. You have any questions for me or any final thoughts on any of this?
Yeah, just thank you for creating this space. Thank you for creating this series. I think you're doing a great job opening to people the breadth of possibility that there is in rope and the different ways people think about it and the different kind of experiences people bring to it. Um, what I'm getting from this series is you talk to 5 people and you're going to get 5 very different perspectives on nominally the same activity. And somebody might see um, Knothead or IP Cookie Monster or me tying, and we could each be doing exactly the same tie. And
Mm.
it could be an entirely different experience for us and for the people we're tying with. And that's the perspective we've come to you with. And I really thank you for allowing that to get out there in the public and what each of us are thinking about and what you're thinking about. I also appreciate your vulnerability during this time. So thank you. This was great.
Hey, yeah, no, I mean, like, a big focus with this is I want to have all of the conversations. I want to hear all of the perspectives. I, in my head, maybe I'm ambitious, but I want to interview all of the people because every single interview that I've done, I've gained so much from. And it's been very rewarding and humbling. And I'm looking forward to continuing to open the space up to more than just the not to like diminish, but like the 101 stuff where we like this is how you tie a TK or this is how you flog, but more so this is like why we desire it, maybe. Like, and in my head, like I fathom like these 301 type of conversations. So, huh. Well, I greatly appreciate it. I'm gonna go ahead and end the stream. If you can just go ahead and hang on 1 second, we'll say goodbyes off air. Uh,
Will
to
do.
summarize this was um, Surrender Your Brain, the Neuroscience and Rope. We had Neuromancer on for about 2 hours, just diving in really deep. I hope you guys appreciated the conversation. I know I did. The last thing I'll say is, Neuromancer, do you have any shameless plugs? Do you have any, upcoming classes or any research data that you would like to make public or anything like that? Books coming out?
Sure. So the one thing I will point to is that Evie Vane has written this book called um, Better Bondage for Everybody. And I do have a chapter in there on rope neuroscience where I talk about a lot of the details of what we talked about, a lot of the EEG examples and things I go into in some depth. So that's the big shameless plug is for her book. I think it's a great book overall, and I really like my chapter. Um, I am not going to be teaching rope for the next few months, but we do have a class or two coming up at the Geeky Kink Con, um, and that's going to be in Pennsylvania. It's Grove City, Pennsylvania. The Chamber of Secrets puts that con on. That'll be in, I think, May.
That's not too far.
And yeah,
You have to send me a link. I might have to try to make it out that way.
all right, good.
Awesome. Well, once again, Neuromancer, I greatly appreciate your time. Thank you. See you guys next time.